On the 15th of May 1455, on a field near the small town of St Albans, the first blood was shed in a war destined to span 30 years and claim the lives of tens of thousands of Englishmen. This war would eventually receive a name that would only appear centuries later: the Wars of the Roses. Yet, on that May Day, none of the participants could have suspected that a small skirmish between feuding factions of the nobility would be the beginning of a bloody confrontation that would change the fate of England forever. To understand the causes of this war, one must go back several decades. In 1422, King Henry V, the last great conqueror of England, who had subjugated a significant part of France, died. His son, Henry VI, inherited the throne as a 9-month-old infant. The regency over the kingdom was assumed by the young monarch's uncles. However, even upon reaching adulthood, Henry VI proved incapable of ruling. He was a pious gentleman, prone to bouts of madness, the complete opposite of his warlike father. The king's weakness created a dangerous situation. England was losing the French territories that had been conquered with such difficulty. The nobility divided into factions, each of which sought to control the king and, through him, the entire country. Two main parties formed around representatives of the Plantagenet dynasty. On one side stood the Lancastrians, led by King Henry VI. Their heraldic symbol was the red rose. On the other were the Dukes of York, who used a white rose in their coat of arms. Both branches descended from King Edward III, who reigned in the 14th century, and both could lay claim to the throne. Richard Plantagenet, 3rd Duke of York, was one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. Through his mother, he descended from the second son of Edward III, and through his father from the fourth. By the laws of succession, his rights to the throne were no worse and perhaps even better than those of Henry VI. After all, the grandfather of the latter, Henry IV, had seized power by force in 1399, overthrowing the legitimate king, Richard II. This old wound never fully healed. The Lancastrians had ruled for over half a century, but their legitimacy always raised questions among the nobility. The confrontation intensified due to the influence of Queen Margaret of Anjou. She married Henry VI in 1445, when she was only 15. Margaret proved to be the complete opposite of her husband, willful, decisive, and ruthless. When the king descended into another bout of madness, it was she who took matters into her own hands. The queen gathered a party of Lancastrians around her and fiercely opposed any attempts by the Duke of York to gain influence at court. She became particularly hostile after the birth of their son, Edward, Prince of Wales, in 1453. Now she had an heir who had to be protected at any cost. In that same year, 1453, Henry VI fell into a state of total insanity. He did not recognize those around him, could not speak, and did not react to what was happening. The kingdom was left without a ruler. Parliament appointed the Duke of York protector of the realm, the de facto ruler during the king's illness. Richard received what he had strived for years: real power. He began to implement reforms, remove the queen's supporters from important posts, and restore order to the finances. But his triumph was short-lived. On Christmas 1454, the king unexpectedly regained his senses. His mind cleared as suddenly as it had clouded. Margaret of Anjou immediately took advantage of the moment. She convinced her husband to remove the Duke of York from his position as protector and return power to the hands of the Lancastrians. Richard and his supporters found themselves in danger. The queen did not hide her desire to deal with them. The duke realized that he had only one way out: to gather an army and forcibly defend his right to participate in the governance of the kingdom. In the spring of 1455, Richard of York gathered an army of his vassals and marched on London. With him were his main allies, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and his son, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who would later be nicknamed the Kingmaker. The royal army, led by the Duke of Somerset, the Queen's chief advisor, marched to meet the rebels. On May 22, the opponents met in the small town of St Albans, 50 kilometers north of the capital. The Battle of Street Albans was more of a skirmish than a full-scale battle. About 6,000 men participated on both sides. The Yorkist troops entered the town through narrow streets and caught the royal army by surprise. The fight lasted less than an hour, but its consequences were enormous. The Duke of Somerset was killed by a crossbow bolt right in front of the castle inn. Also killed were the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford, crucial supporters of the Lancastrians. King Henry VI himself was wounded in the neck by an arrow, though not mortally. The Queen and her son were safe in London. After the victory at Street Albans, the Duke of York once again became protector of the realm. He solemnly swore that he was not claiming the crown. His goal, he claimed, was only to protect the kingdom from bad advisors and help the sick monarch rule the country. Perhaps at that moment, Richard was sincere. He did not declare himself king, although he had the opportunity to do so. Instead, the Duke tried to reconcile the warring parties and create a semblance of stability. But Queen Margaret would not forgive him for the death of her allies and would not accept his power. The next few years passed in a tense confrontation. The Duke of York ruled in the king's name, but his power remained shaky. The Queen gathered supporters in the north and west of the country, preparing for a new clash. In 1456, Richard was forced to step down as protector. The king had recovered again, and Parliament did not want to extend the Duke's powers. The Lancastrians returned to court, and the situation escalated once more. Both sides hoarded resources. The Yorkists relied on the wealthy southeastern counties, the merchant city of London, and the support of part of Parliament. The Lancastrians controlled the north with its warlike nobility, loyal to the old traditions of feudal devotion. Margaret of Anjou worked tirelessly, forging alliances, making promises, and mobilizing resources. She was ready for anything for the sake of her son, for the sake of preserving the throne for the Lancastrian dynasty. Richard of York, in turn, knew perfectly well that retreat meant death. The Queen would leave him and his family no chances. In 1459, the conflict erupted with renewed vigor. The Queen openly gathered an army in the north, preparing for a decisive collision. The Duke of York and his allies, the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick, also began mobilization. In the autumn, the Battle of Blore Heath took place in Staffordshire. The army of the Earl of Salisbury, moving to join the main forces of the Yorkists, clashed with superior Lancastrian forces under the command of Lord Audley. Despite the enemy's numerical superiority, Salisbury achieved victory using the skillful tactics and discipline of his troop. The Yorkists joined their forces and moved to the town of Ludlow in Shropshire, where the Duke's residence was located. But the royal army was more numerous, and among the Yorkist soldiers, hesitation began to set in. Many did not want to fight against the king himself, who formally led the Lancastrian forces. On October 12, on the eve of the Battle of Ludford Bridge, a large part of the Duke of York's army deserted. Among the deserters were experienced soldiers under the command of Andrew Trollope, who defected to the king's side. Left almost without an army, the Yorkists were forced to flee. The Duke of York, with his youngest son Edmund, took refuge in Ireland, where Richard held the post of Lord Lieutenant and enjoyed the support of the local nobility. The Earl of Warwick, together with the Duke's eldest son, the 18-year-old Edward, Earl of March, fled to Flanders. There ruled the Burgundian Duke, Philip the Good, an adversary of the French court and a potential ally of the English rebels. The Queen triumphed. Her enemies were routed and expelled. Parliament, which gathered in Coventry in November 1459, declared the Yorkists traitors and confiscated their estates, but Margaret of Anjou underestimated her opponents. In June 1460, the Earl of Warwick suddenly landed in Kent with a small detachment. Supporters immediately began flocking to him. Southeast England, which had always sympathized with the Yorkists, rose against the rule of the Lancastrians. A few weeks later, Edward of March joined Warwick with reinforcements from Wales. Their army grew rapidly. The common people were dissatisfied with the rule of the French Queen, with taxes, and with the disorder in the country. London merchants openly supported the Yorkists, for Margaret owed them huge sums. On July 2, the Yorkist forces entered London without resistance. The city met them as liberators. The Earl of Warwick immediately began negotiations with the king, who was in the capital. Henry VI, a kind but weak man, agreed to a compromise. On July 10, a grand ceremony of reconciliation took place in St. Paul's Cathedral. The king and the Earl of Warwick walked hand in hand along the nave of the cathedral as a sign of restored peace, but the real solution was to come from the battlefield. Queen Margaret had gathered an army in the north. Her troops, consisting mainly of northern lords and their vassals, moved south. The Yorkists set out to meet them with an army significantly smaller than the royal one but superior in discipline and armament. On the 10th of July 1460, the opponents met at Northampton. The battle began during a heavy rain, which made it impossible to use artillery and crossbows. The Battle of Northampton was decided by betrayal. Lord Grey of Ruthin, who commanded a part of the royal forces, had secretly negotiated with the Yorkists. In the heat of the battle, he switched to their side along with his men. The royal army was routed in less than an hour. Among the dead were the Duke of Buckingham, the Earl of Shrewsbury, Lord Beaumont, and Lord Egremont, the flower of the Lancastrian nobility. King Henry VI himself was taken prisoner and brought to London, where he was placed in the royal palace under the guard of the Yorkists. The Queen and her son fled to Wales, then to Scotland. The victory at Northampton changed the balance of power. Now the Yorkists controlled not only the capital but also the king himself. The war seemed to be over, and the Duke of York would once again become protector of the realm. But Richard decided to go further. In October 1460, he returned from Ireland to England with the firm intention of demanding the crown. On October 10, the Duke entered London and went straight to the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament was in session. He walked into the Assembly Hall and placed his hand on the throne, a symbolic gesture signifying his claim to royal dignity. The reaction was unexpected. Even the Duke of York's supporters were not ready for such a development. The Earl of Warwick and other lords kept silent. They were ready to rule in the name of a weak king, but not to directly overthrow the Lord's anointed. The Archbishop of Canterbury asked the Duke to set out his claims in writing. Richard presented a document justifying his right to the throne through his descent from Edward III and the illegality of the Lancastrian rule, which had seized the throne by force in 1399. Parliament found itself in a difficult position. On one hand, formally, the Duke's arguments were strong. His lineage indeed gave him the right to claim the crown. On the other hand, Henry VI was an anointed king who had reigned for more than 30 years. Overthrowing the monarch meant setting a dangerous precedent that could lead to endless dynastic war. Several weeks of tense debate followed. Finally, on October 25, a compromise was found, the Act of Accord. According to this document, Henry VI would remain king for life, but after his death, the crown was to pass to the Duke of York and his heirs. Prince Edward, the son of Queen Margaret, was stripped of his right of succession. The Duke of York became protector and regent of the kingdom. Henry VI signed this act. Perhaps the meek king even felt relief. He had never strived for power and was glad to shift the burden of ruling to other shoulders. But for Queen Margaret, this decision was unacceptable. Her son had been declared an illegal heir. Her own position was destroyed. She would never accept this outcome. The Queen was in Scotland, from where she energetically prepared for revenge. She formed an alliance with the Scottish regent, promising to give Scotland the border town of Berwick in exchange for military aid. Margaret also sent envoys to France, asking for support from King Louis XI, but her main support remained the northern lords of England, the families of Percy, Clifford, Dacre, and others, for whom loyalty to the Lancastrians was a matter of honor. By the winter of 1460, the Queen had gathered a significant army in Yorkshire. The Duke of York could not leave this challenge unanswered. In early December, he set out for the north at the head of an army of about 5,000 men. With him went his youngest son, Edmund, 17 years old, the Earl of Salisbury, and other supporters. The Earl of Warwick remained in London to guard the king. The Duke's eldest son, Edward of March, was in Wales, gathering reinforcements. Richard planned to spend Christmas at his Sandal Castle near the town of Wakefield in Yorkshire, and then move against the Queen. But the Duke underestimated the strength of the enemy. The Lancastrian army, led by the Duke of Somerset, the son of the Somerset who had died at Street Albans, numbered about 15,000 men. On December 30, on the eve of the new year, the Yorkist forces were blocked in Sandal Castle by superior enemy number. The exact circumstances of the subsequent events remain disputed. According to one version, the Duke decided to break through to his allies and exited the castle with a small detachment. According to another, he was lured out of the fortress by a false report of arriving reinforcements. The Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460 became a catastrophe for the Yorkists. The Duke's small detachment was surrounded by vastly superior Lancastrian forces in an open field. The fight was short and bloody. The Duke of York fought desperately but was killed in the fray. His son Edmund also died. He was only 17 years old. The Earl of Salisbury was captured and, the next day, beheaded at Pontefract Castle by the order of the Lancastrians. About 2,500 Yorkist soldiers fell on the battlefield or were executed after the battle. The Lancastrians celebrated their triumph with the cruelty characteristic of that era. The head of the Duke of York, adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his claims to the throne, was placed on the gates of the city of York, along with the heads of his son and the Earl of Salisbury. Queen Margaret had won a decisive victory. The Yorkist cause seemed lost forever. Their leader was dead, their army routed, but Richard of York had sons remaining, and the eldest of them, 19-year-old Edward, Earl of March, was determined to avenge his father. News of the catastrophe at Wakefield reached London in the first days of January 1461. The Earl of Warwick and other Yorkist supporters were shocked, but there was no time to delay. The Queen was already leading her army south, intending to liberate the king and restore the fullness of Lancastrian power. Warwick gathered all the forces he could and marched to meet the enemy. On February 17, the armies met at Street Albans, the same place where this war had begun 6 years earlier. The Second Battle of Street Albans on the 17th of February 1461 turned into a defeat for Warwick. His army, exhausted by a long march and demoralized by the death of the Duke of York, could not withstand the onslaught of the Northerners. The Earl was forced to retreat, leaving about 4,000 killed and wounded on the battlefield. Worse still, King Henry VI fell into the hands of Queen Margaret. Warwick had taken him along on the campaign, hoping to use his presence to legitimize his action. Now the king was once again with his wife and son. The Lancastrians seemed to have won the war. Their army stood a few dozen kilometers from London. The Queen demanded that the city let her in and recognize the king's authority. But the Londoners, frightened by rumors of looting committed by the Northern army on its path, closed the gates. The city council refused to let Margaret's army enter, fearing plunder. The Queen did not dare to storm the city. Her soldiers were tired, and supplies were running low. Instead, she retreated to the north, taking the king and the prince with her. This decision became a fatal mistake. While Margaret hesitated under the walls of London, Edward of March, the eldest son of the late Duke of York, had won an important victory in Wales. On February 2, the 19-year-old Edward crushed the Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire. Before the battle, a rare atmospheric phenomenon appeared in the sky, a parhelion, where the sun appears surrounded by two bright spots of light. The soldiers took this as a bad omen, but Edward declared that the three suns symbolized the Holy Trinity blessing their call. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross was a decisive victory. The Lancastrian troops were routed. Their commander, the Earl of Wiltshire, fled, but many others were taken prisoner. Edward showed cruelty unusual for him. He was usually merciful to the defeated, but not this time. Owen Tudor, the grandfather of the future King Henry VII, was beheaded in Hereford along with other commanders. Before the execution, Owen did not believe that the young earl would dare to execute him until he saw the axe and the block. His final words were, The head that lay on the lap of Queen Catherine shall now lie on the block. After the victory, Edward moved to join the Earl of Warwick. They met a few days before the Queen reached London. The news of Margaret's retreat from the capital gave them confidence. On February 26, the combined Yorkist army entered London. The city met them with jubilation. The tall, handsome young Edward of March made a very different impression than his cautious father. In him, people saw a savior capable of ending the strife and restoring order. The Earl of Warwick realized that a simple return to the Act of Accord was not enough. Henry VI was now back with the Queen, and his word meant nothing. A new king was needed, strong, decisive, and capable of leading an army into battle. On March 3, in the residence of the Bishop of London, a council of Yorkist supporters gathered. The Earl of Warwick, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and other lords proposed that Edward accept the crown. They formally asked the opinion of the people gathered in London. Soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, the crowd shouted in approval. On the 4th of March 1461, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV. His coronation would take place later, but already Edward was king in the eyes of all who controlled the center and south of England. He was only 19 years old. He was the youngest person to ascend the English throne since the Norman conquest. Tall, over 190 centimeters, handsome, charming, and brave, Edward IV immediately won popularity. But popularity was not enough. A military victory was needed. In the north, Queen Margaret and King Henry VI still commanded a significant army. The war was far from over. Edward did not dally. By mid-March, he had set out for the north at the head of an army of about 40,000 men. It was the largest army gathered during the entire war. The Earl of Warwick and his brother John Neville, Lord Montague, commanded the wings of the army. The young king personally led the center. The army moved quickly, covering the distance from London to Yorkshire in 2 weeks. The Lancastrians had also gathered all their forces. Their army numbered about 40,000 men, perhaps even more. This was the largest clash of the war. On March 29, Palm Sunday, the armies met near the village of Towton in Yorkshire. The day was frosty, with a piercing north wind blowing. Snow fell periodically. The battle began early in the morning and lasted all day, a rare occurrence for medieval battles, which usually ended in a few hours. Both sides fought with desperate courage. This was a decisive struggle. In the heat of the battle, the Earl of Warwick, to boost morale, ordered his horse to be killed and swore to fight on foot alongside his soldiers. Victory or death. The Battle of Towton became the bloodiest battle ever to occur on English soil. Contemporaries spoke of 28,000 killed. Later researchers consider this figure an exaggeration. Likely, between 9,000 and 15,000 men perished. But even these losses were monstrous for the era. The battle went with varying success until the middle of the day, when reinforcements under the command of the Duke of Norfolk arrived to aid Edward. About 5,000 fresh troops. They struck the flank of the already exhausted Lancastrian army. The enemy line wavered and began to retreat. The retreat quickly turned into a disorderly flight. The pursuit of the fleeing continued for many kilometers across snow-covered fields. Edward's soldiers gave no quarter. Too much hatred had accumulated over the years of war. Too fresh was the memory of Wakefield and the executed father and brother of the king. Thousands of people were cut down during the flight or drowned while trying to cross the Cock River, which was swollen by spring rain. Among the killed were the Earl of Northumberland, Lord Dacre, and Lord Neville, the most important Lancastrian commanders. The Earl of Devon was captured and beheaded the next day. King Henry VI, Queen Margaret, and Prince Edward managed to flee the battlefield and take refuge in York, and then retreated to Scotland. The victory at Towton decided the outcome of the war, at least for the coming years. Northern England was subdued. Edward IV entered York in triumph, where he removed the heads of his father, brother, and the Earl of Salisbury from the city gates, and buried them with honor. In their place were placed the heads of the executed Lancastrian lords. The cruelty of those years knew no bounds. Both sides responded to violence with new violence. On the 28th of June 1461, the coronation of Edward IV took place at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent and solemn. The new king wanted to show that the Yorkist dynasty had come to power to stay. The Archbishop of Canterbury personally placed the crown on the head of the young monarch. The Earl of Warwick stood nearby, proud of his role. Without his support, his wealth, and his military talents, Edward would never have ascended the throne. Warwick realized this perfectly and expected corresponding gratitude. In the following months, Edward methodically strengthened his power. He distributed lands and titles to his supporters, appointed loyal people to important posts, and organized the administration of the conquered north. The main Lancastrian castles were besieged and taken one by one. By the end of 1461, resistance in England was practically suppressed. Queen Margaret, with her husband and son, took refuge in Scotland, from where she vainly tried to organize a new invasion. The Scots provided her with shelter, but nothing more. Their own kingdom was too weak to interfere in English affairs. Edward IV proved himself an able ruler. He was not only a talented military commander but also a skillful administrator. The king restored order to the finances, encouraged trade, and patronized the London merchants. His rule brought long-awaited stability after years of strife. The common people breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, it was possible to go about one's business without fearing that another army would plunder the harvest or burn the house down. But within the ruling Yorkist faction, contradictions matured. The Earl of Warwick was used to being the chief advisor, the de facto ruler of the kingdom. The young Edward initially listened to his advice, for the Earl was an experienced politician and military leader, and the king was but a youth. But Edward matured quickly and increasingly made independent decisions, not always coinciding with Warwick's opinion. The first serious conflict arose over foreign policy. The Earl of Warwick believed that England needed an alliance with France against Burgundy. He conducted negotiations with King Louis XI and planned Edward's marriage to a French princess. The king, however, leaned toward an alliance with Burgundy, whose duke, Charles the Bold, was wealthy, influential, and hostile to France. While these disagreements remained hidden, they were bound to come to the surface. In 1464, an event occurred that finally ruined the relationship between the king and the Earl of Warwick. On May 1, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a Lancastrian knight killed at the Second Battle of Street Albans. Elizabeth was beautiful, but not of royal blood, nor rich, and could not bring political benefits. The marriage was purely one of love. Edward became infatuated with the young widow and, having met a refusal to become his mistress, offered her his hand and heart. For several months, the marriage was kept secret. When the king finally announced it at a council meeting in September, the Earl of Warwick was furious. He had been conducting negotiations for the king's French marriage, had given certain promises to Louis XI, and now found himself in a foolish position. But the issue was not just that. The new queen brought numerous relatives to court: brothers, sisters, 2 sons from her first marriage. All of them received titles, lands, and advantageous marriages. The Woodville family rapidly turned into the most influential faction at court, pushing aside the old Yorkist nobility. The Earl of Warwick felt he was losing influence. The king consulted him less and less often, listening more to the Woodville. The old comrades in arms were also dissatisfied. They had fought for the Yorkists, risked their lives, and now, yesterday's Lancastrians were receiving honors and wealth. Particularly indignant was George, Duke of Clarence, the king's younger brother. He was next in the line of succession, but the birth of daughters to Edward and Elizabeth Woodville threatened to push him away from the throne if a son were to appear. For several years, the contradictions were hidden behind a facade of unity. Edward continued to rule successfully, though not without problem. In 1464, Queen Margaret tried to land in Northumberland with French help, but her small detachment was quickly routed. Margaret fled back to France, where she found refuge at the court of Louis XI. Henry VI remained in England. In July 1465, he was captured in Lancashire and taken to London. The former king was imprisoned in the Tower, where he was treated with respect but kept under strict guard. By 1467, the relationship between Edward IV and the Earl of Warwick had deteriorated completely. The last straw was the marriage of the Duke of Clarence to Isabella Neville, the daughter of the Earl of Warwick. Edward forbade this marriage, rightly fearing that the alliance of his brother with the powerful Earl could pose a threat. But Clarence and Warwick disobeyed. On the 11th of July 1469, in Calais, where Warwick was captain of the fortress, a secret wedding took place. This was an open challenge to the king. The Earl of Warwick decided to repeat what he had done 9 years before, overthrow the undesirable monarch and put a more compliant one on the throne. As such, he saw the Duke of Clarence, his son-in-law. In July 1469, Warwick and Clarence raised an uprising in the north. Their supporters, acting under the guise of a popular movement against the king's evil advisors, captured several cities. Edward moved to suppress the rebellion, but on July 26, his army was routed at Edgecote Moor by forces nominally led by a commoner named Robin of Redesdale, but actually directed by Warwick's emissaries. After the battle, the Earl of Warwick arrested the king. Edward was taken to Middleham Castle and kept there effectively as a prisoner. Warwick executed several of the king's closest advisors, including the queen's father, Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, and her brother, John Woodville. The earl intended to rule in the name of the captive monarch, but the situation was different from that with the spineless Henry VI. Edward IV was popular, strong-spirited, and had many supporters. Keeping him in imprisonment proved impossible. In September 1469, a new uprising in support of the Lancastrians broke out in the north. The Earl of Warwick could not suppress it without the royal army, and gathering an army without the king was impossible. He was forced to release Edward. The king immediately took control of the situation, suppressed the uprising, and returned to London. Outwardly, he forgave Warwick and Clarence, even organizing a public ceremony of reconciliation. But trust had been lost irretrievably. The Earl of Warwick realized he was in danger. Edward could at any moment arrest him and execute him for treason. In the spring of 1470, Warwick organized a new mutiny in Lincolnshire. His idea was to raise an uprising again, break the royal army, and this time definitively overthrow Edward. But the plan failed. On March 12, at Bosworth Field, royal troops crushed the rebels. Among the documents captured after the battle were letters that clearly proved the participation of Warwick and Clarence in the plot. Now the Earl had no choice but to flee. Together with Clarence, his daughter Isabella, and her husband, he boarded ships and set sail from Dartmouth. Edward declared them traitors. Warwick tried to take refuge in Calais, but the fortress captain, now appointed by the king, refused him entry. The ships wandered the English Channel for several weeks. On one of them, Isabella gave birth to a child. The infant died almost immediately. Finally, in May, the French king Louis XI allowed Warwick to enter the port of Honfleur in Normandy. Louis saw in the disgraced earl a useful tool against Edward IV, who had concluded an alliance with Burgundy, France's main enemy. But making Clarence king was impossible. He had no support in England. He was a minor figure. Louis proposed a daring plan to reconcile Warwick with Queen Margaret and restore Henry VI to the throne. For a man who 9 years earlier had routed the Lancastrians and put Edward on the throne, this was an incredible turn of events. But Warwick was ready for anything for the sake of returning to power. On the 25th of July 1470, in the castle of Anjou, a meeting took place between the Earl of Warwick and Queen Margaret. The meeting began with difficulty. Margaret hated the man who had killed her supporters and taken the crown from her husband. Warwick knelt before the queen for a full 15 minutes, begging for forgiveness. Finally, she extended her hand for a kiss. They concluded an alliance. Warwick pledged to restore Henry VI to the throne, in exchange for which he received the post of chief advisor and forgiveness for all past deeds. To seal the alliance, a betrothal was arranged between Prince Edward, the 17-year-old son of Margaret, and Anne Neville, the younger daughter of the Earl of Warwick. The wedding was decided to be postponed until their return to England. Louis XI provided Warwick with money, ships, and soldiers. The strange alliance was ready to strike. On the 9th of September 1470, Warwick's fleet sailed from France and, on the same day, thanks to a favorable wind, landed in Devon. The Earl brought with him about 2,000 French soldiers but counted on massive support in England, and it was not long in coming. Many were dissatisfied with Edward's rule, high taxes, the influence of the Woodvilles, and unsuccessful foreign policy. Old Lancastrian supporters, who had kept quiet for 9 years, emerged from their hiding places. Detachments from all over the country flocked to Warwick. Edward IV was in the north, where he was suppressing small uprisings. When news of Warwick's landing reached him, the king tried to gather an army and move south, but his main military leader in the north, John Neville, Marquess of Montague, the biological brother of the Earl of Warwick, suddenly switched to the rebels' side. Edward's detachment found itself surrounded by hostile forces. The king had to escape by fleeing. On October 2, Edward, along with his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and several hundred loyal men, boarded ships in Lynn and sailed to Flanders. The Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, his brother-in-law, his wife Margaret of York was the sister of the English king, provided shelter for the fugitives. Edward was 28 years old. He had lost the kingdom as suddenly as he had once acquired it. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, with 3 daughters, took refuge in Westminster Abbey, where she exercised her right of sanctuary. On October 6, the Earl of Warwick entered London in triumph. He immediately went to the Tower and liberated Henry VI, who had spent 5 years in imprisonment there. The former king had changed significantly. He was 49 years old, but he looked like an old man. Years of confinement, bouts of madness, and shocks had broken him. Contemporaries wrote that when Henry was led out of the Tower, he was dressed in a worn blue robe, dirty and bewildered. He was led through the streets of London and proclaimed king again. The readaptation, the second reign of Henry VI, had begun, but everyone understood that the real ruler was the Earl of Warwick. Henry merely attended ceremonies, signed documents that were thrust before him, and prayed in the chapel. Warwick convened a parliament, which declared Edward IV a usurper, restored the rights of the Lancastrians, and confiscated Yorkist estates. The Duke of Clarence, Warwick's son-in-law, received back his titles and land. Formally, he had switched to the Lancastrian side along with his father-in-law. Queen Margaret, with her son, remained in France. She was in no hurry to return, not trusting Warwick and fearing that the restoration might be short-lived. Events showed that her caution was justified. Warwick's rule lasted less than 6 months. The Earl found himself in a difficult position. He needed to simultaneously maintain power in England, prepare for a possible invasion by Edward, and fulfill obligations to Louis XI, who demanded a declaration of war against Burgundy. On the 2nd of November 1470, on All Saints' Day, Queen Elizabeth Woodville gave birth to a son in Westminster Abbey. The boy was named Edward. He was the legitimate heir of Edward IV, Prince of Wales by Yorkist right, although officially this title belonged to the son of Henry VI. The birth of an heir strengthened the determination of the ousted king to regain the throne. In Flanders, Edward was gathering strength. Charles the Bold initially hesitated. Openly supporting the deposed king meant war with France and England simultaneously. But in January 1471, Parliament in London, at the insistence of Louis XI and Warwick, indeed declared war on Burgundy. Charles had nothing left to lose. He provided Edward with money, mercenaries, and ships. On March 14, a small fleet of 36 ships sailed from Vlissingen, heading for the shores of England. Edward planned to land in friendly Norfolk, but headwinds and Warwick's ships patrolling the southern coast forced him to change course. On the 14th of March, 1471, The fleet arrived at the shores of Yorkshire at the mouth of the River Humber. Edward landed with about 2,000 men, English exiles, the rest being Flemish and German mercenaries. The situation looked desperate. Yorkshire was a Lancastrian stronghold. Local residents met the landing with hostility. The city of Hull refused to open the gates. Edward realized that directly proclaiming claims to the crown would be counterproductive. He announced that he had come only to demand back the Duchy of York, his lawful inheritance. Under this pretext, the city of York agreed to let him in on March 18, though with a limited number of men. Having spent 2 days in York, Edward moved south. On the way, supporters began joining him. A key moment was the decision of Sir William Stanley and his brother, Lord Stanley, influential northern magnates, to maintain neutrality. They did not support Edward, but they did not act against him either, which was tantamount to support. The king's army grew with each passing day. On March 29, Edward was already in Nottingham at the head of 6,000 men. The Earl of Warwick was in Coventry, gathering troops. He sent urgent appeals to all his supporters, demanding they immediately join him. But many hesitated. Some did not arrive in time. Others waited to see which side fortune would favor. Warwick counted on the help of his brother, the Marquis of Montague, who was recruiting an army in the north. He also counted on the Duke of Clarence, his son-in-law, who was supposed to bring troops from the southwest. But Edward acted faster. He sent secret messages to Clarence, reminding him of their brotherly bonds, promising forgiveness and restoration to all rights. It was easy to convince the Duke. He realized that under the Lancastrians he would never receive the throne he secretly craved. Prince Edward, the son of Henry VI, was the legitimate heir. Clarence remained only a junior partner to Warwick with no real prospects. With his brother, he could count on more. On April 3, the armies of Edward and Clarence met near Banbury. Warwick, receiving the news that his son-in-law was moving with an army, rejoiced. Now the combined forces would crush Edward. But Clarence did not attack. Instead, the two brothers met in the middle between the armies, hugged, and Clarence solemnly announced his return to the side of the Yorkists. Warwick lost 5,000 soldiers and an important ally. Now, a combined army of about 12,000 men was moving against him. The Earl took refuge in Coventry behind strong walls and refused to come out to fight. Edward stood outside the city for several days, challenging Warwick to battle, but the Earl was waiting for the arrival of Montague with the northern army. The king realized that time could not be wasted. He left a part of his troops to observe Coventry and moved on London with a rapid march. On April 11, Edward entered the capital. The city opened its gates without resistance. Londoners had never loved Warwick and his French alliance. In the Tower, Henry VI was still being held. Edward immediately took the former king into custody. At Westminster Abbey, he met his wife and saw his son for the first time, who was already 5 months old. Then the king urgently gathered all available forces. It was necessary to immediately move to meet Warwick, who now, having joined with his brother, was leading an army of about 15,000 men on London. Edward gathered about 9,000 men, including the London garrison, and on April 13 set out for the north. On Holy Saturday, the 14th of April 1471, the armies met near the town of Barnet, 20 kilometers north of London. Both sides settled for the night in battle order, preparing for the morning battle. The night was foggy. Visibility was almost zero. Artillerymen on both sides fired blindly in the dark, but because of the fog, the lines of the armies were shifted relative to each other. Most projectiles flew wide of their target. At dawn, the fight began. The thick fog did not lift. Soldiers could barely distinguish each other from a distance of a few meters. The battle broke into a series of separate skirmishes along the entire front. Edward's left wing, under the command of Lord Hastings, was retreating before the onslaught of the Earl of Oxford's troops, who were fighting on Warwick's side. The king's right wing, led by the Duke of Gloucester, conversely, was pressing the opposing troops of the Duke of Exeter. In the center, The commanders-in-chief themselves fought. Edward IV personally led his men into the fight. The king was always a brave warrior and fought in the front ranks. The Earl of Warwick, on the contrary, kept to the rear, coordinating the actions of the troops. In the heat of the battle, a fatal incident occurred. The Earl of Oxford's detachment, having routed Edward's left wing, chased after the fleeing, got distracted by plundering the baggage train, and was out of the fight for a long time. When, an hour later, the Oxford soldiers returned and tried to join the battle again, due to the fog, they were mistaken for enemies. On the Earl of Oxford's banner was a star with rays, which in the fog was easy to confuse with the sun with rays, the emblem of Edward IV. Warwick's troops, seeing an approaching detachment in the fog with a star on their banners, decided it was the enemy and opened fire with bows. The Oxford soldiers responded in kind. Panic began. Cries of treason, treason, swept through the ranks of the Lancastrian army. Many decided they had been betrayed and turned to flight. Warwick tried to stop the panic, but unsuccessfully. His army wavered and began to retreat. Edward immediately took advantage of the moment and ordered an advance along the entire front. The retreat turned into a flight. The Earl of Warwick, who had always fought in armor on horseback, this time followed his own example from 9 years ago at Towton. He ordered his horse to be killed and fought on foot alongside his soldiers, showing that he would share their fate to the end. But it did not help. When the army fled, the Earl found himself in a trap. He tried to break through to the horses to escape, but was overtaken and killed in a small forest north of the battlefield. Together with him, his brother, the Marquis of Montague, who remained loyal to the end, perished. The Earl of Oxford and the Duke of Exeter managed to flee. The Battle of Barnet lasted about 3 hours and cost the lives of approximately 4,000 people. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man who had twice decided the fate of the English throne, perished at the age of 42. The bodies of Warwick and Montague were taken to London, and for several days were exhibited in St. Paul's Cathedral so that no one would doubt their death. Then they were buried in the family vault in Bisham Abbey. Edward IV regained the throne, but the war was not over yet. On that very day, April 14, when the king was celebrating his victory at Barnet, Queen Margaret landed at Weymouth on the southern coast of England. Margaret brought with her her son Prince Edward, her daughter-in-law Anne Neville, the daughter of Warwick, who had not managed to marry the prince, although she was considered his wife by the ceremony of betrothal. With them were a few hundred French soldiers. The Queen was counting on Warwick. The news of his death at Barnet reached her almost immediately after landing. Many advised returning to France immediately. The Lancastrian cause looked hopeless. But Margaret of Anjou would not have been herself if she had retreated. She had spent 10 years in exile, fighting for her son's right. Surrendering now meant admitting that all of this had been in vain. The main one was Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, the half-brother of Henry VI, a man absolutely devoted to the dynasty. He was recruiting an army in Wales. If Margaret could join him, she would have an army for a new battle. The Queen moved north through Devon and Somerset, gathering supporters along the way. Old families of the Lancastrian nobility were joining her. The Courtenays, Beaumonts, and local knights who remembered the old times. The army grew slowly, but it grew. 2 weeks after the landing, Margaret had about 6,000 men. Edward IV did not waste time. He gave the army only 3 days of rest after Barnet and set out in pursuit. A race began. Margaret sought to cross the Severn River and join Jasper Tudor in Wales. Edward tried to catch her before the crossing. Both armies performed forced marches of 50 kilometers a day, an incredible speed for that time. On May 3, the Queen approached Gloucester, hoping to cross the Severn there. But the city governor, Sir Richard Beauchamp, loyal to Edward, refused to open the gates and held the bridge. Margaret had to go further north to the next crossing at Tewkesbury. Her soldiers were exhausted by the continuous march. Many deserted along the way. On May 4, the Lancastrian army crossed the Severn at Tewkesbury, but it was already too late. The royal army had caught up with them. Edward forced the crossing in their wake and, early on the morning of May 4, deployed his troops in battle order on the meadows near Tewkesbury. Margaret had about 6,000 men, Edward about 5,000. But his soldiers were better armed and trained, and most importantly, they were led by a king victor who had already won 4 major battles. The Lancastrian army was nominally commanded by the 18-year-old Prince Edward, but effectively, decisions were made by experienced military commanders, the Duke of Somerset and Lord Wenlock. There was no agreement between them, which played a fatal role. The battle began around 10 a.m. The Duke of Somerset, commanding the Lancastrian right wing, tried to outflank Edward's left, but the king foresaw this maneuver and had beforehand positioned 200 archers in a nearby forest under the command of a capable officer. When Somerset's detachment exposed its flank, the archers struck from ambush. Simultaneously, the Duke of Gloucester, commanding Edward's left wing, attacked head-on. Somerset's detachment was crushed and thrown back. The Duke, in a rage, returned to the main line and accused Lord Wenlock, commanding the center, of not supporting the attack. According to the Chronicle, Somerset, in his anger, smashed Wenlock's head with a battle-axe right on the battlefield. Whether this is true or not is unknown, but it is certain that Wenlock died in that battle. The center of the Lancastrian army wavered. Edward IV personally led his troops in an attack. The enemy line crumbled. The flight began. Prince Edward, the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, the last legitimate heir of the House of Lancaster, died in the battle. The circumstances of his death are unclear. Some sources claim he fell while fighting bravely in the thick of the battle. Others say the prince was captured during the flight and killed by order of Edward IV or his brothers when he was brought to the king. One way or another, Margaret's only son died before reaching 19. With him, the last hope of the Lancastrians vanished. The Duke of Somerset took refuge in Tewkesbury Abbey along with other noble Lancastrians. The church gave the right of sanctuary, and formally they were safe, but Edward IV had no intention of observing this right. On May 6, soldiers dragged the fugitives from the abbey and organized a show trial. The Duke of Somerset, Sir John Langstrother, the Grand Prior of the English Order of Hospitallers, Sir Thomas Tresham, and about 10 other knights were beheaded in the Tewkesbury Market Square. Edward wanted to finish off the Lancastrian leadership once and for all. Queen Margaret was captured a few days after the battle. They found her in a small religious house nearby, where she was hiding. The woman who for 15 years had been the soul of the resistance to the Yorkists, organized countless conspiracies, and 3 times gathered armies, was brought to London as a captive. Edward did not execute her. Executing a queen would have looked too cruel and could have caused sympathy. Instead, Margaret was imprisoned in the Tower, where she spent the next 4 years. In 1475, King Louis XI ransomed her, paying 50,000 gold crowns. The former Queen of England returned to France, but the darkest page was written in London on May 14. On the same night that Edward IV entered the capital in triumph after the victory at Tewkesbury, Henry VI died in the Tower. The official version announced that the former king had passed away from melancholy and grief upon learning of his son's death. But no one believed this explanation. Everyone realized that Henry had been killed by the order of Edward or, at the very least, with his consent. According to the most common version, Henry VI was killed by the Duke of Gloucester, the king's younger brother, the future Richard III. The body of the unfortunate king was exhibited in St. Paul's Cathedral. The face was uncovered, and contemporaries noted traces of blood. Then Henry was buried in Chertsey Abbey without special honors. He was 49 years old, 39 of which he had spent as king, first nominal, then deposed, then restored, and deposed again. A gentle and pious man, completely unsuited for the cruel era in which he lived. He became a victim of the struggle for power, which he himself had never desired. With the death of Henry VI, his son Prince Edward, and most of the adult male Lancastrians, their dynasty effectively ended. There remained only distant relatives on the female line. The most significant of these was the 14-year-old Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, the son of Margaret Beaufort, the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, the third son of Edward III. His rights to the throne were highly questionable. The Beaufort branch descended from the illegitimate children of John of Gaunt, later legitimized, but with a clause regarding their exclusion from the line of succession. Henry Tudor was in Wales under the guardianship of his uncle Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke. After Tewkesbury, the situation became dangerous. Edward IV methodically exterminated all potential Lancastrian claimants to the throne. Jasper Tudor fled with his nephew to Brittany, where Duke Francis II provided them with shelter. There, Henry Tudor spent the next 14 years in exile, not even suspecting that one day he would return to become king. In 1471, after the victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury, the Wars of the Roses seemed over. Edward IV completely controlled the kingdom. The Lancastrians were destroyed, opponents were dead, in exile, or had submitted. The king distributed lands and titles to loyal people, strengthened the administration, and developed trade. The next 12 years of his reign were a period of relative peace and prosperity. Edward IV proved himself an able administrator. He restored order to the royal finances, which for decades had been in a deplorable state. The king personally involved himself in trade affairs, invested money in commercial enterprises, and patronized London merchants. Under him, the export of English wool and cloth, the kingdom's main goods, resumed. The treasury filled up to such an extent that in the last years of his reign, Edward almost stopped collecting taxes from the population, an unheard-of luxury for a medieval state. The king also patronized art and education. He gathered a magnificent library and supported the first English printer, William Caxton, who in 1476 founded the first printing press in England in Westminster. Edward was one of the first European monarchs who appreciated the importance of the new invention. He ordered printed books, gifted them to his entourage, and promoted the spread of literacy among the nobility. But behind the outward prosperity, contradictions were hidden that ultimately led to a new round of the conflict. The main one was the rivalry between the family of Queen Elizabeth Woodville and the traditional Yorkist nobility. The Woodvilles held key positions at court. The Queen's brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, was the governor of the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne. Another brother, Sir Edward Woodville, commanded the fleet. The Queen's sons from her first marriage, Thomas and Richard Grey, received significant estate. The old nobility, who had fought for the Yorkists from the very beginning, looked at the rise of the Woodvilles with dislike. This especially concerned Duke Richard of Gloucester, the king's younger brother, a man absolutely devoted to Edward, a brave warrior and a capable administrator. Richard governed northern England as a de facto independent ruler, maintained order on the border with Scotland, and enjoyed the respect of the local nobility. But at court, his influence was minimal. All important decisions were made with the Queen and her relatives. Another source of instability was the Duke of Clarence, the middle brother of the king. Edward had forgiven his treason and restored all his rights and estates, but Clarence remained dissatisfied. He believed he deserved more. He dreamed of the crown and plotted intrigues. In 1477, Edward's patience ran out. Clarence was accused of high treason, convicted by Parliament, and executed on the 18th of February 1478. According to legend, the Duke was drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, his favorite drink. Most likely, this is a fabrication, but the exact method of execution is unknown. On the 9th of April 1483, after a short illness, King Edward IV died. He was only 40 years old. In his final years, he led a luxurious life, ate and drank heavily, which undermined his health. Death caught him suddenly. The king did not manage to properly prepare, although he had appointed a council of regency for his underage heir. 12-year-old Edward V became king, but real power became an object of struggle between the Woodvilles and the Duke of Gloucester. According to the late king's will, Richard of Gloucester was appointed Lord Protector of the realm until his nephew came of age. But the Woodvilles did not want to share power. The Queen Dowager Elizabeth and her brother Earl Rivers controlled the young king, who was in Ludlow in Wales under the guardianship of River. They planned to quickly deliver the boy to London and crown him, after which Gloucester would lose his formal grounds for the protectorate. But Richard of Gloucester acted decisively. On April 30, when the procession with the young king was heading to London, the Duke met it at Stony Stratford with an armed detachment. Earl Rivers and others accompanying Edward V were arrested on charges of conspiracy against the Protector. The boy king passed under the control of his uncle. Queen Elizabeth, upon hearing what had happened, in a panic took refuge in Westminster Abbey together with her younger son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. This was her second refuge within the walls of the Abbey in 12 years. On May 4, Richard of Gloucester entered London in triumph, accompanied by his nephew. The young king was placed in the royal apartments of the Tower. At that time, it was still a royal residence, not just a prison. A coronation was being prepared, scheduled for June 22. Gloucester ruled as protector, relying on the support of part of the nobility and the London Council. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. But on June 13, at a council meeting in the Tower, Gloucester suddenly accused Lord Hastings, the closest friend of the late Edward IV, of treason. Hastings was immediately led away and beheaded in the Tower courtyard without trial. Several other councillors were arrested. Richard announced that he had uncovered a plot by the Woodvilles and their supporters against him. On June 25, Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and Thomas Vaughan, who had been arrested a month earlier, were executed. On June 16, the younger son of the late king, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, was taken from his sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and placed in the Tower with his older brother. Officially, this was explained by the need to prepare for the coronation. The boy was supposed to participate in the ceremony, but the coronation never took place. On June 22, the preacher Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cathedral, in which he announced that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was illegal. According to this version, before marrying Elizabeth, Edward had been secretly betrothed to Lady Eleanor Butler, the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. Betrothal in those times was considered almost equal to marriage and made the subsequent marriage invalid. Consequently, the children of Edward and Elizabeth were illegitimate and could not inherit the throne. The only legitimate heir remained Richard of Gloucester, the next son of the Duke of York in seniority after the late Edward and the executed Clarence. On June 25, an assembly of lords and representatives of cities that gathered in Westminster accepted a petition calling on Richard to accept the crown. The next day, the Duke of Gloucester gave his consent. On the 6th of July 1483, he was crowned as King Richard III. His wife Anne Neville, the younger daughter of the Earl of Warwick, the widow of Prince Edward of Lancaster, became queen. Their only son, Edward, was proclaimed Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. The fate of Edward IV's children remains one of the greatest mysteries of English history. Edward V and his younger brother, known as the Princes in the Tower, were seen playing in the fortress gardens in the summer of 1483. Then they disappeared. Officially, nothing was ever announced about their fate. Richard III claimed they were alive and safe, but allowed no one to see them. Most contemporaries were convinced that the boys had been secretly killed by the king's order. In 1674, during repairs in the Tower, a wooden box with the bones of 2 children of approximately the right age was found under a staircase. They were reburied in Westminster Abbey as the remains of the princes. In 1930, the bones were examined. The analysis showed they indeed could belong to boys aged 12 and 10 who died in the 15th century. But there is no definitive proof, and the question remains open. The usurpation of Richard III, if it was a usurpation, caused indignation among part of the nobility. Many did not believe the story about the illegality of Edward IV's marriage. Even among Yorkist supporters, there were those who considered Richard's actions a betrayal of his nephews. Already in the autumn of 1483, a mutiny broke out. It was led by the Duke of Buckingham. Richard's recent ally who had played a key role in his accession to the throne. The uprising was poorly organized and quickly suppressed. The Duke of Buckingham was captured and beheaded on the 2nd of November 1483. But more important was that the rebels had proclaimed as their candidate for the throne Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was still in exile in Brittany. Henry was the last adult male who had any connection to the House of Lancaster. The rebels proposed he marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, thus uniting the claims of both dynasties. Henry Tudor swore to fulfill this promise. For the next 2 years, he prepared for the invasion, gathering funds, recruiting supporters among English exiles, and conducting negotiations with France. King Charles VIII, who had just ascended the throne, supported him with money and troops. France was interested in weakening England with a civil war. Richard III, in turn, was preparing. He knew that the invasion was inevitable. The king strengthened the defenses of the southern coast, gathered troops, and tried to gain the support of the nobility. But many hesitated. The disappearance of the princes cast a shadow over Richard. Rumors of infanticide spread throughout the country. The king tried to refute them but could not produce his nephews alive, because they were already dead or because it would have destroyed his argument about the illegality of their origin. On the 7th of August 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales with an army of about 2,000 men, most of whom were French mercenaries. This was a desperate gamble, a tiny army against an entire kingdom, but Henry counted on the support of the Welsh, among whom his Tudor family enjoyed influence, and on the dissatisfaction of the English nobility with Richard III's rule. The pretender moved eastward through Wales toward the English border. Welsh gentry detachments began joining him. The most important addition was his uncle Jasper Tudor, who returned from exile and brought with him several hundred warriors. The army grew slowly. Many waited, not wanting to risk it until the outcome was decided. But there was no mass resistance either. Henry crossed the border unhindered and entered England. Richard III was in Nottingham, where he had gathered a significant army of about 10,000 men. Learning of Tudor's landing, the king moved to intercept. His army was much larger and better armed than the pretenders, but Richard realized the main danger: the unreliability of part of his supporter. A key role was played by the Stanley brothers, Lord Thomas Stanley and Sir William Stanley, influential magnates from the northwest, each of whom commanded several thousand warriors. Lord Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor. His loyalty was doubtful, but Richard could not refuse his support. That would mean losing almost a third of the army. The king kept Lord Stanley's son, George, Earl of Strange, with him as a hostage, hoping to ensure the father's loyalty by this. Richard's army moved southwest to meet Tudor. Stanley's troops followed nearby but kept apart, not joining either side fully. On August 21, the opponents met near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Henry Tudor had about 5,000 men, his initial detachment, plus Welsh and English volunteers who had joined on the way. Richard had about 8,000 inches, his main army, not counting Stanley's detachments, which took positions on the flanks, waiting. The total number of troops on the field reached 20,000, which made Bosworth one of the largest battles of the war. In the morning of August 22, the armies deployed in battle order on hilly terrain near the village of Bosworth. Richard III occupied a strong position on the summit of Ambion Hill. His army, under the command of the Duke of Norfolk, built itself into a classic battle order with crossbowmen and archers in front, infantry in the center, and cavalry on the flank. Tudor's army, under the actual command of an experienced military leader, John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, the very same who had fought at Barnet and Tewkesbury on the side of the Lancastrians, positioned itself below. The battle began with an attack by Oxford's troops on the positions of the Duke of Norfolk. The fight was fierce. Norfolk fought bravely but was killed by an arrow to the face. His son, the Earl of Surrey, took command and continued to fight. The front line froze in a bloody struggle. Neither side could overcome the other. The outcome of the battle depended on which side Stanley's detachments would take. Richard III sent Lord Stanley an order to immediately enter the battle, threatening to execute his son. Stanley refused, declaring that he had other sons. The king realized that betrayal had occurred, but he did not execute the hostage. There was no time and no benefit from that anymore. Instead, Richard made a decision that many historians would call desperate and others heroic. The king noticed that Henry Tudor was located at some distance from the main forces with a relatively small detachment of personal bodyguard. If the pretender were killed, his army would lose the meaning of its existence and scatter. Richard gathered his personal retinue, about 80 knights and squires, and led them in a desperate attack across the battlefield straight at Henry Tudor. This was an attempt to decide the outcome of the war with one blow. Richard III's cavalry charge became legendary. The king personally fought in the front ranks with fury and courage. He killed the royal standard-bearer, William Brandon, fought with the experienced warrior John Cheney, whom he threw to the ground. Tudor's guards wavered. The pretender himself was in mortal danger, but at this critical moment, Sir William Stanley's detachment entered the battle. He struck the royal knights in the flank, surrounding them. Richard's small detachment was overwhelmed by superior forces. The king was offered a chance to flee. He still had a chance to break out of the encirclement and save his life. According to legend, Richard replied, "Treason, treason, but the crown of England I will not betray." He continued to fight until he was knocked off his horse and killed in the struggle. He was 32 years old. Richard III's body, covered with multiple wounds, was found among a pile of the killed. The crown, which had fallen from his helmet during the battle, was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head right on the battlefield. Thus ended the Battle of Bosworth, the last great battle of the Wars of the Roses. About 1,000 men died, including King Richard III and the Duke of Norfolk. The Earl of Surrey and other noble Yorkists were taken prisoner. Richard's body was thrown across a horse and taken to Leicester, where it was exhibited to the public for 2 days so that no one would doubt his death. Then the king was buried without special honors in the Church of the Franciscans. The monastery was destroyed during the Reformation under Henry VII, and the location of the grave was lost. In 2012, archaeologists discovered the remains under a parking lot in the center of Leicester. DNA analysis confirmed that it was indeed Richard III. In March 2015, the last Yorkist king was reburied with honors in Leicester Cathedral. On the 30th of October 1485, in Westminster Abbey, the coronation of Henry VII took place, the first king from the Tudor dynasty. Parliament recognized his rights to the throne, although legally they were more than shaky. Henry descended from John of Gaunt through the illegitimate Beaufort line. His claims were based more on the right of conquest than on inheritance. But after decades of war, the country was tired of bloodshed and was ready to accept any ruler capable of ensuring peace. On the 18th of January, 1486, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. This marriage symbolically united the houses of Lancaster and York red and white roses. The heraldic symbol of the new dynasty became the Tudor rose, red and white, connecting both. Their eldest son, Arthur, born in September 1486, became the heir to the throne, in whose veins flowed the blood of both warring dynasties. But the peace was still fragile, and the Yorkists had not reconciled with their defeat. Many noble families remained loyal to the memory of Edward IV and Richard III. They sought a pretender around whom they could unite, and pretenders were found or created. In the next 15 years, Henry VII had to repel several serious attempts at overthrow, connected with impostors claiming to be surviving princes of the Yorkist house. The first mutiny flared up already in the spring of 1486. Francis Lovell, Viscount Lovell, the closest friend of the late Richard III, and the Stafford brothers raised an uprising in Yorkshire and the Midlands. The mutiny was quickly suppressed. The Staffords were executed, but Lovell fled and took refuge at the court of Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV and Richard III. Margaret became the main patroness of Yorkist pretenders, using her wealth and influence to organize conspiracies against Henry VII. In 1487, the first impostor appeared. A 10-year-old boy named Lambert Simnel was put forward by Yorkists as the Earl of Warwick, the son of the executed Duke of Clarence. The real Earl of Warwick was in imprisonment in the Tower. Henry VII kept him there as a potential pretender to the throne, but the Yorkists claimed that the one imprisoned in the Tower was a sub, and the real Warwick was with them. Lambert Simnel was crowned in Dublin as King Edward VI. Ireland traditionally supported the Yorkists. In the spring of 1487, Yorkists, led by the Earl of Lincoln, a nephew of Richard III, landed in Lancashire with an army of about 8,000 men, including 2,000 German mercenaries provided by Margaret of Burgundy. They moved south, hoping to raise an uprising in the traditionally Yorkist counties. On the 16th of June 1487, at Stoke Field near Newark, a battle occurred between the royal army and the rebels. The battle was fierce and lasted about 3 hours. The German mercenaries fought professionally, but the royal troops exceeded the enemy in number and ultimately achieved victory. The Earl of Lincoln was killed in the battle along with the majority of Yorkist commanders. Viscount Lovell fled from the battlefield and disappeared. It is assumed that he drowned while crossing a river, although his body was never found. Lambert Simnel was captured alive. Henry VII showed mercy. The boy was merely an instrument in the hands of adult conspirators. He was not executed, but assigned to work in the royal kitchen. Later, Simnel was promoted to the position of royal falconer and lived a long, peaceful life. This demonstrative mercy was a political move. The king wanted to show that he was confident in himself and did not fear miserable impostor. But a few years later, a much more dangerous pretender appeared. In the autumn of 1491, at the court of Margaret of Burgundy, a young man of about 17 appeared, claiming he was Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes in the Tower, who had miraculously escaped from the killers. In reality, this was Perkin Warbeck, the son of a merchant from Tournai in Flanders, but he was smart, educated, charming, and played his role convincingly. Margaret of Burgundy publicly recognized him as her nephew. Following her, several European monarchs also recognized or pretended to recognize his claims. King Charles VIII of France, Emperor Maximilian I, King James IV of Scotland, all of them at various times supported Warbeck, seeing in him a tool for pressuring England. Henry VII was seriously concerned. He published detailed information about Warbeck's real origin, but many did not believe or pretended not to believe. In the summer of 1495, Warbeck tried to land in Kent but was repelled. He sailed to Ireland, where he besieged Waterford, but also unsuccessfully. Finally, in the autumn of the same year, Warbeck arrived in Scotland, where King James IV received him with honors, recognized him as the lawful King of England, and even gave him his relative Lady Catherine Gordon in marriage. In September 1496, the Scots conducted a raid into northern England in support of Warbeck, but the local population did not support the uprising. By 1497, Warbeck had squandered the trust of his patrons. James IV began peace negotiations with England and cooled toward the pretender. In July, Warbeck sailed from Scotland with 2 ships and a small detachment, heading to Cornwall, where an uprising against taxes had just flared up. On September 7, he landed near Land's End and declared himself King Richard IV. Several thousand Cornish rebels joined him. Warbeck's army moved east and besieged Exeter, but the city held out, and royal troops were gathering from all sides. On September 17, realizing the hopelessness of the position, Warbeck secretly left his army and fled to Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire, seeking sanctuary. His supporters were routed and scattered. On October 5, the impostor surrendered to royal troops. Henry VII ordered him to be taken to London. They did not execute Warbeck immediately. Instead, The king forced him to publicly confess to being an impostor and read a confession about his real origin. Then, Warwick was kept at court in honorable confinement, periodically exhibited at public ceremonies as a curiosity. But in August 1499, Warwick tried to escape. He was seized and imprisoned in the Tower. There, Warwick found himself in the same cell as the Earl of Warwick, the real nephew of Edward IV, who had spent almost his entire life in confinement since the age of 8. Jailers, perhaps by the king's order, provoked both prisoners into an escape attempt. The conspiracy was uncovered, and this gave Henry VII a reason to get rid of both. On the 23rd of November 1499, Perkin Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn as a common criminal. On November 28, the Earl of Warwick was beheaded on Tower Hill. He was 24 years old, 14 of which he had spent in confinement, without having committed any crime other than having Yorkist blood. The execution of the Earl of Warwick in 1499 became the symbolic end of the Wars of the Roses. The last adult representative of the male line of the Plantagenets who had an indisputable right to the throne had been destroyed. There remained other distant relatives, the Earl of Suffolk and his brothers from the de la Pole family, nephews of Edward IV and Richard III, but their rights were less obvious. The Tudor dynasty solidified its hold on the throne. Henry VII lived for another 9 years after the execution of Warwick. These were years of peace and consolidation. The king methodically strengthened royal power, subdued the unruly nobility, and restored finances. He was stingy, calculating, suspicious, completely unlike the brilliant Edward IV or the brave Richard III. But it was precisely these qualities that allowed him to create a solid foundation for the new dynasty. The main tragedy of the final years of Henry VII's reign was the death of his heir. In April 1502, Prince Arthur, the eldest son of the king and queen, died. The youth was only 15 years old. He had been married for several months to the Spanish Infanta Catherine of Aragon. Arthur embodied the hopes of the dynasty. In him, the lines of Lancaster and York were united. His name reminded one of the legendary King Arthur, the symbol of Britain's unity. His death from illness was a blow to the aging king. The heir became his younger son, 11-year-old Henry, Duke of York. To preserve the Spanish alliance, it was decided to betroth him to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. For this, a papal dispensation was required, as marriage with a brother's widow was formally forbidden by church law. The dispensation was obtained, although this marriage 30 years later would become the cause of England's break with Rome and the beginning of the Reformation. On the 21st of April 1509, Henry VII himself died. He was 52 years old, almost 24 of which he had spent on the throne. During this time, he transformed the kingdom, which had been devastated by civil war, into a stable and relatively prosperous state. The treasury was full, order was restored, the dynasty proved to be durable. His son, Henry VIII, ascended the throne, a 17-year-old youth, handsome, educated, athletically built, the complete opposite of his cautious, stingy father. But the memory of the Wars of the Roses long haunted the Tudors. Henry VII, paranoiacally afraid of pretenders to the throne, executed several representatives of the Yorkist line. In 1513, Edmund de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, a nephew of Edward IV, who had spent years in confinement, was beheaded. In 1541, by order of Henry VIII, the 70-year-old Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, the daughter of the executed Duke of Clarence, and the last representative of the Plantagenet line, was executed. Her only crime was her proximity to the throne. The Wars of the Roses claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Englishmen over 30 years with interruptions. Entire noble families were destroyed. The Percys, Nevilles, Beauforts, Staffords, and many other ancient lineages died out or lost influence. 3 kings perished: Henry VI, Edward V, and Richard III, and a countless multitude of princes, dukes, and earls. The country was devastated, the economy undermined, royal power was weakened. But ultimately, the war led to important changes. The old feudal nobility, capable of maintaining private armies and challenging the king, was weakened. The new nobility, which rose under the Tudors, depended on royal favor and could not claim independence. The foundation was laid for a strong, centralized monarchy, which in the 16th century would turn England into a great power. The war also demonstrated the weakness of a purely dynastic principle of legitimacy. Kings changed, were overthrown, were killed, and life went on. Parliament played an increasingly important role in determining the succession to the throne. This created precedents that centuries later would be used for limiting royal power and the development of a constitutional monarchy. For common Englishmen, the war left a memory of the bloody chaos that ensues when the nobility decides questions of power by force of arms. This memory contributed to the popularity of the Tudors, who, for all their faults, ensured stability and peace. Even the tyranny of Henry VII proved preferable to the anarchy of civil war. In cultural memory, the Wars of the Roses remained as a dramatic period of English history, full of valor and betrayal, heroism and villainy. William Shakespeare, at the end of the 16th century, created a cycle of historical dramas about the war, which formed the representation of it for centuries. The images of Richard III, the villain, noble Henry VI, beautiful Edward IV, and powerful Margaret of Anjou became part of English culture. Modern historians argue about the causes, character, and consequences of the war. Some see in it a struggle of political factions for power, others a crisis of the feudal system, others the result of the weakness of central power. Likely, all are right. The war was a complex phenomenon, generated by a multitude of factors, but its main lesson is obvious. When elites place personal ambitions above the common good, the whole country suffers. The Wars of the Roses ended in 1485 on the field of Bosworth, when the crown flew from the head of the killed Richard III and was lifted for Henry VII. Symbolically, it ended in 1486 with the marriage of Henry and Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses. Legally, it ended in 1499 with the execution of the Earl of Warwick, the last direct heir of the York. But in a broader sense, it ended only when the generation that remembered the war passed away, and England turned its face toward the future of Tudor England, the Reformation, maritime discoveries, and imperial greatness. 30 years of bloodshed, dozens of battles, hundreds of executions, thousands dead. Such was the price of the struggle for the crown between two branches of one dynasty. The history of the Wars of the Roses is a history of human ambitions taken to the extreme, a history of betrayal and loyalty, cruelty and mercy, courage and cowardice. It is a story about how great deeds and terrible crimes are committed by the same people, and how from chaos and destruction a new order is born. A story that, centuries later, continues to agitate the imagination and reminds one of the fragility of peace and the high price of violence.